All right, well, it is 12 o'clock noon, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm Elizabeth Coots. I am the University of Kentucky, Woodford County Extension Agent for Family and Consumer Sciences. I am glad that you are here joining us today to learn about pressure canning. We are going to get started, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a PowerPoint that is going to guide us through this presentation today. Let me share it correctly here. All right. Okay, so to get started, if you would type in the chat your name and where you live, and also what is your experience with canning, and why do you want to, or why do you can? And while you're doing that, I'll just share for me personally, I already introduced myself, and I'm here in Versailles in Woodford County, Kentucky. My experience with canning, on a personal note, I can remember being a little child and helping my grandmother in particular can, particularly tomatoes. She always canned tomatoes along with a plethora of many other fruits and vegetables, but I specifically remember tomatoes. I can remember, just helping in the kitchen. I know a lot of people who take my classes say that they remember their mother or grandmother canning and being in the kitchen with them. And they remember that the adults would say, all the kids out of the kitchen, it's dangerous, don't come in. So a lot of people who have taken my class remember that, and they have it in their mind that pressure canning is dangerous. You know, it's something that not everybody can do, and you don't want to be around it because it's dangerous. Well, I am here to tell you that pressure canning is not dangerous as long as you follow the methods and you take care of your equipment and use it appropriately. It is not dangerous. So I want you, if you're in that boat, maybe I want you to take this class and leave this class today with confidence to be able to use your pressure canner, utilize it, and can safely. That's my personal experience that I've mentioned canning, but as an extension agent, I've been teaching canning for several years, and it's one of the areas that I'm pretty passionate about just because I want people to know that this is something that there's research done in canning, and we want to make sure to follow that research, because if you were to can these green beans incorrectly, then yeah, it could potentially be dangerous. Somebody could get sick if you didn't can it properly. And of course, worst of the worst, somebody could die. That's not very common anymore. But still, we want to prevent getting ourselves or anybody else sick. So that last question there, why do you want to can, or why do you can? So for me, the main reason why I like to can personally is because I can control what's in my food. So if I am canning green beans, I know that the only thing in here is green beans and water. Or if I'm canning, vegetable soup, I know exactly what's in that vegetable soup and that there's no preservatives. I know that it is a good quality product. Okay. So whatever your reason for canning, I hope that through this class that you learn a little more, and that maybe there's another reason why you want to can it, and you learn that today. So our purpose for teaching this class is for you to learn about the research-based methods of home food preservation, and particularly today, of course, pressure canning. As you know, in the day and age of the internet that we are in, there is a lot of information out there, period, but a lot of information out there about canning and all different ways that you can and you can just use any old recipe. Well, I'm here to tell you that some of that information out there, surprise, is not correct and could potentially be unsafe and harmful. So I want you to learn the research-based methods and to also learn some resources that you can use in pressure canning. I want you to learn the difference between high acid and low acid foods and why we use a pressure canner. What instances would we use the pressure canner? We're going to talk about tools and equipment, why we use those and what we use. And then we're going to go through step by step how to pressure can. Okay, so we are going to go through that process today. So again, in talking about research-based methods, you're going to hear me say that quite a bit, research-based methods. We know that microorganisms are present on the surfaces of fresh food, just period. So we should always use these recommendations when we're home canning because we want to prevent any harm or any bacteria, harmful bacteria from growing inside this canned jar. So when we follow these safe procedures, we can ensure that not only is this product going to be safe, but it's going to be a good quality. It's going to taste good. It's fine if this is safe, but if it's not going to taste good, then that kind of defeats the purpose of home canning your own. So those are our two goals, safety and quality as well. So the method that we're using, when I say method, I mean the canning method, it's going to, and the process too in that recipe. So the method is going to depend on what you're canning, but also the acidity or the pH level of the ingredients that make up that recipe. So that's basically going to tell us how we are going to go about the process of canning. So currently there are only two research-based methods acceptable and safe for home canning, and that is the boiling water canning method and the pressure canning method. And of course, today we are talking about the pressure canner. We do have a recorded video on boiling water canning that you can watch later, but today we are going to focus on pressure canning. Pressure canning, sorry. And again, it's going to depend on what you are canning. So low acid foods, that's what we're talking about, low acid foods, which means that the food has a high pH, all have to be canned in a pressure canner in order to be shelf stable, so in order to be safe. And when we say low acid foods, this includes all fresh vegetables, okay? I have today carrots and green beans that I've canned before. So any fresh vegetable, any soup or stock or stew is considered low acid. Any type of meat, poultry, wild game, or fish is also considered low acid. So any of these things all have to be canned in a pressure canner, okay? A boiling water canner is not sufficient. A pressure canner, when properly used, will reach temperatures of about 240 to 250 degrees. Now, if you think about a boiling water canner, so boiling water only gets up to 212 degrees. You can boil that water all day on the highest of heat, and it is only going to get as hot as 212 degrees. In the pressure canner, again, we do this properly, that temperature is going to be higher. So we need that higher temperature and we need the pressure to ensure that what we're canning is a safe canned product. And if you give me just a minute, I am going to check my internet because I just got a message that it is unstable. So if you don't mind, pause.
Hi, everybody. We are having some internet problems. Elizabeth got kicked off of the internet and is trying to get back on as fast as possible. So that is what is holding us up. Hopefully we will get it figured out here really, really shortly.
Apologies about this, everyone. Let us get back to where we were. Okay, where were we? I apologize about that. Let's continue though. Okay, so continuing talking about research-based methods to ensure that you have a safe product and again, a quality tasting product, we want to make sure not to change or modify in any way the recipe, so any of the ingredients in the recipe, or even the process of preparing the recipe, the actual processing method in the pressure canner, and that includes the processing time as well. So the amount of time that that jar needs to be in the pressure canner, make sure to follow that recipe. And just a note that there are no conversions between the pressure canner and the boiling water canner. So I've had that question before. Well, I don't have a pressure canner. The recipe calls to process for 10 times. Can I just double that time in my boiling water canner or triple it or whatever it might be? And the answer is no. The reason for that is because the boiling water canner does not have a way to pressurize. We have to can low acid foods in the pressure canner so that we have that pressure, and again, so that we have that high heat. Those two things make for a vacuum seal. So there's no conversion. And then also open kettle canning or canning in the oven or in pressure cookers, including electric pressure cookers, like the Instant Pot is one of those brands, is not recommended, has not been tested, it is not safe for home canning. Now, steam canners are safe. You may have seen those. It's kind of like an upside down pot with a small base and a large lid that kind of looks like an upside down pot. Those are safe for acidified foods, so high acid foods. So pretty much anything you can in the boiling water canner, you can in a steam canner. So just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that. And definitely that a pressure cooker is different than a pressure canner. A pressure cooker is designed just for cooking. A pressure canner is specifically designed for canning, and typically you can also cook in your pressure canner. Okay, now say that 10 times fast. So I want to talk about some resources, research-based resources. So you should have received from me an email, and maybe you have picked up paper copies of a big stack of publications from the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. All of those resources are research-based, of course, the methods and the recipes, chock full of information. The one publication that we're going to be using today that you can reference and take notes on is the publication titled Home Canning Basics. So as it says, this is the publication that you should read before you can anything else. If you flip in this publication to page 5, this includes steps for successful pressure canning. And we are going to, once we get towards the end of this presentation, we're going to go through those steps step by step. So you can make sure to note that and resource that later. So a couple other resources that you should know about. So the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service houses the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They are the gurus of all things research-based home food preservation. They are testing all of these methods and recipes, and essentially they're putting the information together, and then all of the cooperative extension services across the country are using that information to put it into documents like this publication to then pass out to you. They also have a book that's called So Easy to Preserve that has information in it on all different types of canning, as well as recipes, tips and tricks, and other resources as well. I'm sure you have heard of the Ball brand, and not that I am endorsing Ball at all. That is just a common, well-known name brand for a lot of things home canning and home food preservation. So Ball and Kerr are owned by the same company, Fresh Preserving, and they do their own research. So they have their research testing center, and they have worked with the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and essentially their research and their recipes have been vetted by the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They are safe, they are research-based, so you can use that as a reliable resource. And they have a few different books. This one is kind of a classic. It's called the Ball Blue Book. It's no longer blue, but it's the Ball Blue Book Guide to Preserving. This is a really good resource for getting started, lots of information. And then they have several other books. I have a few different books here that are printed and published by the Ball Company, a little bit more advanced recipes. And there's also freezing and dehydrating and pickling information in those books as well. So those are some good resources. All 3 of these bullet points on the screen here have websites that you can look and search for recipes and other information if you're interested. So again, these are kind of the 3 pillars, I guess I would say, of safe recipes and methods for canning. These are your go-to. Like I mentioned earlier, in the age of internet, there is lots of information out there, and you know as well as I do that there is lots of incorrect information out there. So please utilize these resources, and I'll say this at the end, but if you ever have any questions about a recipe or an old canning recipe maybe that's been passed down, or a canning method, you are always welcome to reach out to me. I am certainly a resource for you, or you can contact your local Family and Consumer Sciences agent in Kentucky. There's an extension office in every county in our state. Okay, so let's get into talking a little bit about the process. I cannot talk about canning or any food preparation for that matter without talking about being safe, and particularly washing your hands. And I know we have heard a lot about washing your hands in this past year, which I know we have all done a lot of. Making sure to use warm soapy water and scrub for 20 seconds. So when you're canning, I like to think of it as going a step beyond just being clean. Okay, think about how you would want someone to cook for you. You would want them to be clean and neat. Avoid eating in the kitchen. Okay, when you're canning, those are all important things to keep in mind. And keeping everything, of course, clean. All your surfaces, all your equipment that you're using, and yourself clean. Because when we think about canning, really safety first is the bottom line. I mentioned earlier that yes, we do want to have a safe or a good quality product, but we want it to be safe as well. Did the view on that just change? Can you still see the PowerPoint? So this is a close-up of this little bacteria. No, I'm kidding. If you've heard of botulism, a lot of people who have taken my classes before have said that's one of their fears, is they're afraid that they're going to get, or they're going to give someone botulism because they can something wrong. Botulism is the illness. Clostridium botulinum is the bacteria that causes that illness. And if you think about it, it's basically the worst of the worst. It's the worst of the worst bacteria that could grow and develop in your jar. So all of these methods, if you kind of think about, that's our goal, is to prevent the growth of Clostridium botulinum. But there's other bacteria that could grow in our canned jars that might just make us really sick and maybe want to die. So we want to prevent those too. I've seen some weird things that people have showed me and asked me questions about that are growing in home canned jars of food. So if we follow these methods and procedures and the recipes, we don't have to worry about this, okay? But that is the reason, again, back to why we recommend and teach research-based methods for home food preservation. All right, so let's get into a little bit of the equipment. So jars, you want to make sure that you're using a mason type jar, okay? And that is a jar that has been specifically designed for home canning. It has been designed to be used through that process, whether in the boiling water canner or the pressure canner, over and over and over again. Okay, and heated and washed and used and sat with food in it over and over and over again. But it's important that when you buy your jars and lids, that you make sure that they were manufactured and advertised as canning jars, because there are lots of jars out there that are just craft jars. And there are also some other jars on the market out there that are advertised as canning jars, but they are an off-brand or a store brand of canning jars. And while those are still safe to use, they are a lesser quality. So if you buy those store-bought or off-brand jars, you will likely have more instances of the jar breaking or the lids not sealing, something failing, basically using those less quality jars. So the name brands for the jars that you want to look for are Ball and Kerr, like I mentioned earlier, and also Golden Harvest. Those are the three main name brand jars that are a better quality, that will hold up longer, that you don't have to worry about. So every year when you reuse your jars, you want to make sure to check for any nicks or cracks, especially in the top of the jar. And if there's not, then again, you can use those over and over and over. So some of the tools and utensils, let me back up here to the lids and the rings. So it's recommended to use the two-piece flat, the flat lid, and then the screw band. The flat lid can only be used once. These have to be replaced each time you're canning. You want to use a new lid, and they just come in a little box. You can buy just the lids. You don't have to buy the rings with them. There is a plastisol material around the edge of this lid, and that is what makes the seal. Okay, there will be the vacuum pulled, and then a seal will form, and that plastisol will form to the top of that jar, holding that lid on. The screw band, or the ring, can be used over and over again, as long as there's no rust, as long as it's not cracked or bent in any way or damaged. You can use those over and over. But the flat lid will go on the jar, and then the screw band will go on just fingertip tight. The screw band does not screw on as tight as you can get it. It's just fingertip tight, because the only purpose of that screw band is to hold the flat lid on while it is processing and then cooling. So we recommend that after you have cooled your jars and they're ready to put in your cabinet, that you take that ring off. That just promotes any moisture from building up around the ring there. And of course, moisture and metal can cause rust, so we want to prevent that. And as long as you have canned it properly, that lid is not going to be coming off of that jar. Okay, so some of the tools and utensils that make canning very easy. Let's see, Ruby, can you, or maybe I should stop sharing my screen so I can show these? Or can you do the side by side?
It's already done side by side.
Oh, perfect. Okay. See, I have great assistants. She can read my mind. So some of the tools and utensils that we have, a canning funnel. Oh gosh, comes in very handy. Trying to do things with one hand here. And that is not only to put things in your jar, to fill your jars, but it also has a second purpose, that it keeps the rim of your jar clean. So if you were doing something, for example, I have carrots here. If I was doing carrots, I still would probably use this funnel, and I would put my cut carrots in here just to keep the edge of the rim of my jar clean. I'm still going to wipe it off, but that'll help. And if you're doing anything, sticky or anything, the canning funnel comes in handy too. It's not just for getting things in the jars. Keep that rim clean. And then we also have a tool here. It's a 2-in tool. Oops, I went 2 slides over when I dropped that jar. This is a bubble remover and headspace tool. So at the end here, there are stair steps, and your recipe will tell you what headspace your jar should be in. We'll talk about headspace, but this is to measure headspace. So we have 1 inch, 3/4, 1/2, and 1/4. And if you sign up for a canning kit, you will get these 3 items. The other end of this tool is a bubble remover. So if I have green beans in my jar and headspace calls for 1 inch, which it does, before I really measure that headspace and make sure that it's accurate, I'm going to take this end of my bubble remover tool, or you can use a plastic knife, something plastic, and you can just put that end down in your jar, and it will release any little bubbles that are trapped in those green beans. So you'll just do that around. That's one thing I remember my grandmother doing, was taking a metal butter knife, and she would just really go around that jar and get all the bubbles out. One reason, well, there's 2 reasons actually we don't want to use metal. It could chip the bottom of the jar, and then it could also react with the food and the liquid that's in the jar. So we want to make sure to use plastic. Another tool that we use is the jar lifter. And of course, this comes in handy when we are putting jars into the canner, okay, lifting them up. And then also when we're taking them out of the canner, because they can be very hot and sometimes very heavy as well. Now you see there's one other little tool in the picture on the PowerPoint, and I have it here. This is a lid magnetic wand lifter. And this is no longer needed, so you can give this to your kids to play with. One thing with the flat lids that used to be recommended and no longer is to heat the flat lid. Okay, so it used to be that you would have to put this lid in hot water on the stove and just kind of keep it hot, keep the water hot. And then when you were ready to use it, you would take this magnet wand and pick up the lid out of the water to put on your jar. Well, it's no longer recommended to do that because of the new plastisol that is around the flat lid. So this is just an extra tool, but I just wanted to mention that. Okay, some of the ingredients that we use in canning. Salt is always optional in canning unless it's a large amount. Like if you were pickling something, you need to use as much salt as in that recipe. But if it's a tablespoon or a teaspoon of salt, it's always optional. And just personally, I like to wait and salt my food after I'm ready to eat these green beans, and I'll salt it to taste as I'm cooking it. But if you want to add salt to your jars, you certainly can, but it is optional. With vinegar, and actually one thing with salt, you want to make sure that you are using canning or pickling salt and not table salt. Table salt can cause things to be, it will make them less firm, and it can also cause liquid in the jar to become kind of cloudy. Well, there are some bacteria that make the liquid in your jar cloudy. So rather than question it, oh, is this cloudy because I used table salt, or is there a bacteria growing in there? I always like to take the question out of it and just make sure that you're using that canning and pickling salt. With vinegar, so it does act as a preservative, usually in things that we're canning in the pressure canner, we're not using a whole lot of vinegar, but you want to make sure that any of the vinegar that you're using, that on the label, somewhere, usually right on the front of the label, it will say 5% acid. This one says reduced with water to 5% acid, and that's white vinegar. And then my apple cider vinegar says diluted with water to 5% acid strength. Typically, most vinegars out there are 5% acidity, but I have seen a couple that are less, and I've seen one that was cleaning vinegar that was stronger. You want to make sure to use 5% acidic vinegar, and just regular vinegar. If you make your own, we don't recommend using that because we don't know what the pH of it might be. And a little tip down there at the bottom, with white vinegar, you can add a little bit of vinegar into your canner when you put your water in, and that will prevent any mineral buildup. And I don't know if you can see this jar very well, but it will prevent any mineral buildup on the outside of the jar. It's not a safety concern, it's just kind of an appearance concern. And here in this area of Kentucky, we do have hard water. So I always add plain white vinegar to the water in my canner just to prevent that. Okay, so a little refresher. So when we talk about which canner to use, so we have low acid and we have acid foods. So low acid foods, any fresh vegetables, any meats or poultry or fish, any soups or stews or stocks, those all have to be canned in a pressure canner in order to be safe. If you're canning an acid food, a high acid food, so that's tomatoes and salsa, anything that's pickled, so even pickled green beans can safely be done in a boiling water canner. Fruits and jams and jellies and preserves. So I just want to make sure that you understand the difference. And when you find a recipe that you want to can, your recipe is going to tell you how to process that product. It's going to tell you in a pressure canner or in a boiling water canner. It won't say either or. It will say use the pressure canner or use the boiling water canner. If you have a recipe that doesn't tell you, or if you have a recipe that says either or, you might question where that recipe came from and what the source of it is. And again, if you're ever unsure, I'm always a resource for you.
We had somebody ask how much vinegar do you add to the water when you are adding it to the water of the pressure canner?
Good question. I didn't say that. So in the pressure canner, a tablespoon or two, it's not an exact. I usually, with canning, of course, I measure everything, but that's one thing that I don't measure. I just kind of do just a little drop. It really doesn't take much to prevent that discoloration from the hard water buildup on your jars. But that's a great question. Sorry, I didn't add that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the actual pressure canners themselves. I'm going to move some of this stuff out of the way. Room here. So we have two types of canners, and you can see them in the picture here. So we have a dial gauge canner, and that's that picture there on the right. And that's what I have back here. I have a dial in the middle of my lid. I can see exactly what the pressure is with the little arrow, with the little hand that goes up and down. I have a vent port or a petcock right here, and this is where the steam is going to come out. We'll talk about that. I also have a lid lock on the front of my lid. When I put this lid, that's a safety feature. When I put the lid on my canner, if there is any amount of pressure in that canner at all, this is going to pop up, and I know that my lid has locked. That's a safety feature. Another safety feature, on the very back, there's this little black button. This is an overpressure plug. So if something were to happen and the pressure built up so high in there that it was getting ready to explode, it wouldn't explode. It would blow this little tiny plug and release the pressure, which would still make a mess, but that would be better than the lid blowing off of the canner, okay? So a couple safety features there. So this is the dial gauge canner. We also have a weighted gauge canner, and this is the lid for the weighted gauge canner. It still has a lid lock. It still has the overpressure plug, but it only has in the middle a petcock or the vent port right in the middle, okay? Both of these lids have a weight that will go on that petcock that will hold the pressure in, but they look different. So on the dial gauge lid, since we are relying on our hand here to tell us exactly what the pressure is, I have a weight. It's just one single weight, and that goes on the lid. With the weighted gauge, I have a different kind of weight that comes apart in 3 pieces. If my recipe calls for 5 pounds of pressure, I put this little weight on, and then it has 2 rings. So if it calls for 10 pounds of pressure, I'll put another ring on. And if it calls for 15 pounds of pressure, I'll put the 3rd ring on. And we'll talk a little more about the difference between these two and with recipes, but that's the difference between the two. There is another type of canner that has a disc-shaped weight, and you can see that on the screen. That's the left picture. It's kind of shaped like a small hockey puck, and it has 3 holes on the outside, on the edges, and it's engraved 5, 10, and 15 pounds for those 3 holes. Okay, so with the dial gauge canner, some pros and cons, I guess. So a benefit of having the dial gauge is you can see exactly what the pressure is from that little hand. It's easier to read and to know exactly what the pressure is in that canner. If you have a dial gauge, it should be checked at least once a year to make sure it's accurate. And lucky for you, your local extension office checks these dial gauges. We do that for free. That is a service that every extension office in the state will offer. So if you have a dial gauge and maybe you haven't ever checked it, call me and we can make an appointment, or call your local extension agent and make an appointment to have that checked. Like I said, we recommend that it be checked every year. When you're done canning, maybe bring it in and have it checked. If it is off by more than 2 pounds, then we will recommend you replace it. But if it's off 1 or 2 pounds, we can help you to adjust that so that you can still use it safely. A con, I guess, of the dial gauge canner is that you have to watch it. Is that you know exactly what the pressure is, so you kind of have to babysit a little bit to make sure that your pressure is not going too high. But for me, the pro is that I can see exactly what the pressure is, and I prefer that. So the dial gauge canner, a benefit of the weighted gauge canner, a benefit of the weight is that this is the only piece that you need for the top is just this weight. You don't have to test it. There's not a way to test it, actually. As long as you don't drop this weight and it's not damaged or chipped in any way, then it will remain accurate for life. A lot of people like the weighted gauge canner because you can hear it. It makes a noise, and you don't have to stand right there and watch it to make sure that it's the right pressure. You can hear it if you're over at the sink. Now, you still have to pay attention to it, but you don't have to be right there. So pros and cons, one is not safer than the other. It's just personal preference, and maybe which one has been handed down to you as well. So pressure canners that were made after 1997 have actually been redesigned with those safety features that I mentioned, and they are much lighter weight, which, once you fill this up with jars, it can be very heavy. But if you are shopping for a pressure canner, you want to make sure to look for one that has been approved by the underwriter's laboratory, and usually it'll just say UL on the label, and that stands for Underwriter's Laboratory, to make sure that it meets those current safety guidelines. And if you're ever not sure, just make sure to look at your manual. Look at the information in your manual or the manual and information for that canner to make sure about that. So I mentioned keep all documentation on this slide. That's one thing that I say, if you're ever not sure, if you're not sure how to care for it, check that manual. If you have a canner maybe that you don't have a manual for, you can likely find that online. If you need help with that, I'd be glad to help. But always refer to what it says in the manual for lots of things, but particularly how much water to put in the bottom of the canner. And we'll talk about that. It really depends on the type of canner that you have. And you might see I have a canner over here on the stove next to me. And then right here, they're different size. So this canner takes a little bit more water than this canner does, because I can do 2 stacks in this big canner back here. Sorry. Okay, so with pressure canning, a lot of people don't think about washing your canner or washing the inside, but that is definitely something you need to do. Even though the food is not going to touch the inside, make sure to wash everything. One thing with the pressure canner is on the lid, you have a gasket, and that is something too that needs to come off and be washed. This gasket and the overpressure plug that I mentioned also need to be checked every year to make sure that they are pliable, because they will occasionally need to be replaced. They will get dry rotted and cracked. For safekeeping of your gasket, you can just store it down in the canner, not on the lid. And you can store the lid upside down or just loosely on top. But you want to make sure that gasket is pliable on your lid and that it's clean. So for processing in the pressure canner, this goes back to jars. If your recipe calls for a processing time of 10 minutes or more, 10 minutes or less, so if it's fewer than 10 minutes, you will need to sterilize your jars. And that can just be done in boiling water, in the water that you put in your canner and the steam that comes out of that. But lucky for you, I don't think that you will ever have to do that, because most processing times in the pressure canner call for at least 10 minutes. I don't know that I've ever seen one that's fewer than that, but I always want to make sure people know about that. So if you have your publication, we are now going to go through the steps for successful pressure canning. So you can go through that and take notes. I always encourage everybody to take notes and write things down, because you might forget. Actually, you will forget. So the first step for successful pressure canning, okay, is wash everything, make sure everything is clean, even your countertops. And then you will prepare your recipe. You will fill your jars. We'll talk about that, the Headspace. And you're going to, at that time, put water into your canner. So it's usually 1 to 2 inches of water. That's what this one calls for. And then this is where you will add that white vinegar if you want to do that, if you have hard water. So the next step is to fill your jars. And your recipe, again, will tell you exactly how to do that, but you'll use your funnel, of course, whatever you're canning, you will fill that jar, and then you will adjust the headspace. So remember, when you're adjusting the headspace, that's where your bubble remover headspace tool comes in. You'll remove the air from that product. You'll check your headspace. So most things in the pressure canner have a headspace of 1 inch. Not always, but most things. So you would check to make sure that the liquid level and the level of those pieces is right at the very bottom of your stair steps. And you can see in this video, in this picture on the left, that is a grape jelly. The headspace for that is 1/4 inch. And you can see that tool is right on that jar. And the jelly, the top of that jelly, is just touching the bottom of that tool. And that's how you know that your headspace is correct. But you want to check your headspace after you have removed any bubbles that might be hiding down in any pieces that you have in your jar. Because if you do have those air bubbles and they come up, that means the level of the liquid in your product is going to go down. So you might need to readjust your headspace. Chances are you will have to readjust your headspace. Oops, that's at the end. So this is just a little reminder of Headspace and why Headspace is important. Like I said, and you see low acid foods. So all of our vegetables and meats and stocks and stews are typically 1 inch of Headspace. And again, all of those low acid foods have to be canned in the pressure canner. And it's not always an exact science if you've canned before, particularly I think about green beans. Okay, and I know this picture of green beans looks very nice and level, you know, the liquid is right above those green beans. But in real life, sometimes that's hard to come by, to have the level of liquid in green beans the same. Usually you have green beans that are kind of poking up out of that liquid, and that's okay. That will happen. You know, I can look at this jar and see that there's some green beans sticking up. Not ideal, but it's still safe. Oh, is it still okay?
Yeah, I can see the
Okay.
flicker, but
Okay, having some goofy things happen here. Okay, so let's talk about processing in your recipe. So again, your recipe will tell you all these details about how to can, but sometimes in some recipes, not everything, but it will give you an option of raw pack or hot pack, and you can choose which one do you want to do. I always like to use the example of green beans. So in a nutshell, raw pack is where you're putting the fresh green beans into that jar. They're not cooked, they're just fresh green beans, and then you're pouring boiling water over them to get to your 1 inch headspace. Hot pack, you're essentially cooking those green beans for a short amount of time. So kind of like blanching, but you're not putting them in ice cold water. You're heating them for a short amount of time, putting those hot green beans into your jar, and then covering them with hot boiling water and making sure your headspace is 1 inch. And of course, removing the bubbles in both of those. It's up to you which one you want to choose, but there's pros and cons to these. So raw pack, just putting your raw green beans in your jar, is quicker. You don't have to worry about cooking them. You wash your green beans, you cut them to size, put them in your jar, fill them with boiling water, bubbles, headspace, etc. It's easier, it's quicker. But after you process that jar, you are going to see that there's some space in that jar. You cannot fit as many beans in a jar if your beans are raw packed. For hot pack, even though you have that extra step of cooking them a little bit, you're going to fit more beans into that jar. And you are probably going to have a little better quality on the end. Not saying that your raw pack green beans, you won't have quality. You'll just have a little better quality with the hot pack green beans, okay? So there's pros and cons to both of those, and it's up to you. I have canned specifically green beans in one batch. Half of them were hot packed and half of them were raw packed. And I've done the same with venison. Half of it was hot packed, half of it was raw packed. And you can clearly see at the end, the hot pack, there's more in it, and it kind of looks a little better. But again, I am not saying that I don't do raw pack, because sometimes I just don't have time to do one extra pot on the stove and I just want to get them canned and in the jar. So it's completely up to you which one of those you want to use, but I just want to make sure you know the difference in those. Okay, so we have our water in the bottom of our canner per our manual instructions. We have already filled our jars, checked the headspace. At that time, we're going to put our jars into the canner, and we're going to make sure to keep our jar level. We don't want to tilt it as we're bringing it over to the canner. You're going to make it level, okay? And when you put that jar into the canner, you want to make sure that you have a rack in the bottom of your canner. Actually, you want to do this before you put water in it, but make sure that you have a rack in the bottom of your canner. These come with the canners, but just make sure that you have it in there and that your jars are sitting on that rack. You want to make sure they're not sitting right on the bottom without the rack, because that can be too high of a heat, too direct of a heat, okay? So I'm gonna put all my jars down in my canner. I'm gonna adjust them around, make sure that they're not right next to each other, that there's a little space, okay? I'm gonna go ahead and put the lid on, okay? So no matter which lid I'm using, I'm gonna make sure that the weight is not on. So you wanna make sure that the petcock or the vent port is open, okay? Because that's a very important next step. So I'm gonna put my lid on, and you will know when you put your lid on that your gasket is on correctly and your lid is on correctly. If it's kind of hard to put on, you should feel a little bit of tension when you're putting that lid on. It should be kind of tight. If it goes on really easy, check your gasket, make sure that it's on correctly, make sure that it's pliable, nice and rubbery, because if it's dry rotted, usually that means it's really easy to get the lid on. So make sure that there's a little bit of tension when you put that lid on and that your vent port or your petcock is open, okay? I'm gonna move this up here. So at that time, you are going to put the canner on your stove and you're gonna turn the heat to high on your stove. And we are going to wait, let it heat up. You're gonna start to hear some action going on in there. You'll hear the water start boiling and moving around. And eventually you are going to see some steam or maybe some little water bubbles coming out of this petcock right here, or the vent port in the very top. And basically we're gonna vent the canner. You want to see a nice funnel of steam coming out of this vent port. And you want to make sure that it is constant, okay? Because usually there'll be a little bit of steam and it'll kind of simmer out a little bit more. You want to make sure that it's a full funnel of steam. And we have a video that will show that. Once you see a full funnel of steam that is a constant funnel, you are going to set a timer for 10 minutes. We are basically in this process, we're venting the canner, we're getting all the loose and cool air out, and we are preparing the canner to pressurize properly. If you skip this step, remember earlier when I mentioned that a properly vented canner will reach 240 to 250 degrees, and we need that and the pressure for these low acid foods that we're canning. If you skip this step, and if you just turned your heat on, put the weight on, your canner is not going to get up to 240 to 250 degrees. It's going to be a little bit cooler. So if you do that, your canned food might potentially be unsafe to eat. So this venting part is very important to do. We're ensuring that our food is going to be safe. So we're going to vent 10 minutes, okay? 10-minute timer went off. We're going to put our weight on. Now, if you're using the dial gauge canner, it's going to be the exact same. You're going to vent out of this petcock here, and you're going to wait 10 minutes. After that 10 minutes, you're going to put the weight on. Now, with both canners, that process is going to be the same. And with both canners, probably before you put that weight on, there's going to be enough of a little bit of pressure that builds up in there that your lid lock will pop up. Now, it might not happen until after you put your weight on, after you have vented, but somewhere in that time, your lid lock is going to pop up. You'll see it. Usually there's like some little water bubbles that come out of there, and maybe a little bit of steam is coming out of there. But once there's any pressure in there, that lid lock will pop up and your lid is on. So you know the process is working correctly. So at that time, okay, we've put our weight on. We are going to wait for it to get to pressure. Now, one thing important to note about the weighted gauge, make sure that you're using the correct weight. So typically in the pressure canner, we have 10 pounds of pressure. And again, it will tell you in your recipe, it will tell you if you're using a weighted gauge canner, this is how much pressure you want. If you're using a dial gauge canner, this is how much pressure you want. But typically in a pressure canner, we have 10 pounds. So for this weight, I would have 5 and then 10 pounds like that. So make sure that you're using the appropriate holes or weights in your dial gauge or in your, excuse me, your weighted gauge canner. Keep getting those mixed up. I don't want to confuse you. So at that time, our lid block is up. We have our weights on. We're now going to get it to the pressure that we want. And let's say we are canning green beans. The pressure for green beans is 11 pounds in a dial gauge canner or 10 pounds in a weighted gauge canner. So I do have the 10 pounds on there. So once your weight starts jiggling or your dial reaches 11, then you're going to turn your heat down just a little bit because we don't want it to be a rocket ship and fly off, and we don't want our pressure to continue to raise on our dial. We want to turn it down just a little bit, and you want to do it just a little bit at a time, because if you do it too drastic and your heat drops and then your pressure drops, that's no good. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, you get it up to pressure, and then you're going to start your processing time. So green beans is 20 minutes time. So once my weight is rocking and my dial is up to 11, I'm going to start a 20-minute timer. Now, that's kind of one of those best case practices, but I like to say in the real world, it's not that easy because, like I mentioned, you have to turn your heat down. And particularly with the dial, you keep having to turn your heat down just a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. I like to, when my dial gets to about 10 pounds of pressure, I'll start to turn my heat down a little bit because I don't want it to get too high too fast and be concerned and have to turn it down and have to worry about getting it back down. So when it gets to about 10, I'll turn my heat down a little bit. Usually what will happen in my experience is that the pressure will get up to maybe 12 or 13. I've even had it get up to 14 pounds, and just slowly turning my heat down on my stove to get that pressure to drop. But I want it to drop gradually. And too much pressure, unless you're getting up to the caution danger zone, too much pressure is better than too little. Because if at any time during the 20-minute processing time, if your pressure drops, so if your weight stops rocking, or if your dial indicates that the pressure has dropped below 11 or whatever your recipe says, you need to turn your heat up, heat it up, get the pressure back, get the dial back, or get the weight back rocking, and you have to start your time over again. We want, so again, my example is green beans. It's 20 minutes. We want it to be at that correct pressure for the entire 20-minute time. So that's why if it drops below, you got to get it back up and start your 20-minute time again. So again, it is better for it to be a little bit too high than too low. But again, make sure you don't make it too high and in that danger zone. So you do kind of have to watch it, and it can be different on different stoves. So I like to suggest that, especially if this is your first time canning, take notes about what you're canning, what the pressure was, what the processing time was, and then even how you reduce the heat on your stove. It's easier to go back and review those notes and remember. I know that the stove here at the office, when I can on it with this large canner, usually on a dial on my stove that goes from 1 to 10, I'll usually get down to about a 3. So I am slowly dropping that heat to make sure that my pressure is going to remain constant at 11 pounds. Okay, so with my example of green beans for 20 minutes, our timer has gone off. Ding, 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 ding. At this time, we are going to let our canner naturally cool. We're not going to run cold water over it. That's fine to do with an old-fashioned pressure cooker that you're cooking on the stove. You can do that, take it over to the sink. But with a pressure canner, we want it to be natural cool down. So we are going to let it sit, and we are going to wait until it cools down, which can be a little bit of a waiting game because you really want to open that canner and make sure that your jars are sealed and see your food. So we're going to let it just sit on the stove, turn the heat off, make sure that there's no fan blowing directly on the canner because that can cool it down too fast. The cooling process is still part of the process for canning, for safe canning, okay? So we're going to let it cool. Now, think about how do we know when there's no pressure in the canner? Well, I have the answer on the screen there, but the first thing that will likely happen is that the weight will stop jiggling if you're using a weighted gauge, or on your dial gauge, the dial, the pressure, you'll see it go down to 0. After that, or right around that time, your lid lock will drop. Okay, so it popped up when the lid was locked because there was pressure. When it drops, you know that there's no pressure in there. Okay, so at that time, you are going to remove the weight, okay, the weighted gauge weight or the pressure regulator on your dial gauge. And remember this little petcock where we let the steam come out, okay? Everything is cooled off in there. It's still very, very hot, as you can imagine. But this little tiny bit of air is going to have an exchange to where cool room temperature air is going in and that hot, hot canner air is coming out, which again, it's just the tiniest little bit of air hole, but that is going to cool the canner down just a little bit more, okay? So remember, we want this to be a slow process. After you take that weight off, we're gonna let that exchange of air happen for 10 minutes. So you're gonna set a timer for 10 minutes. And that's just gonna continue to slow it down a little bit more. At that time, you're gonna take the lid off, okay? So we know, I know some people, new canners, are a little nervous at this point to take that lid off, but there's 2 indicators that you know there's no pressure in this canner. One is that the lid lock is down, and the second one is that if there was any pressure at all, it would be coming out of the petcock. But we know that we've waited for it to naturally cool down, so when we took our weight off, we know that there's no pressure in this canner. So we're going to take the lid off, and just a little tip that when you do take it off, hold it away from you, because as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of steam coming out of there. It's pretty hot in that pressure canner. And this is just kind of an option. You can, at this time, wait 5 minutes. And this is just, again, going to cool those jars down just a little bit more, okay? Because now we have obviously a big air hole in our canner where the cool air can go in and the hot air can come out. I have personally had experiences where I've taken the lid off my pressure canner and okay, I'm ready to remove the jars, and I'll remove the jars. And right about at this time, when that hot jar is touching the room temperature, liquid will spew out of the top of that jar in between the lid. And that happens basically because of the extreme difference in temperature. So waiting that 5 minutes can, again, just kind of help to elongate that slowed down time. I will say that if that happens, if liquid spews out of your jar, basically this jar is not going to be shelf stable, because now I have debris. Even if it looks like it's just water, I now have debris underneath my lid, which could compromise the seal. So if that happens, either reprocess it, and we'll talk about that, or you can eat that jar for dinner that night. So you'll remove your jars from your canner. I'm going to set this over here to the side, and you will let those jars sit. And again, when you're taking them out of the canner, make sure that you keep your jars level. You don't want to tilt them at all. Make sure they're level. You'll sit them out on the countertop just at room temperature. Make sure there's no fan blowing. Make sure to set them on, I like to sit them on a towel. Make sure not to sit them on granite or any natural stone, because that can be too cold. Or like I have a metal countertop here at the extension office, I don't want to set them directly on that because that might be too cold. We want to make sure, again, back to the process of cooling, should be a slow process. At that time though, when you take them out, you should hear the jar pop, which is always fun to know that your jars have sealed. But we're going to let them sit undisturbed with space in between them, space to where the air can flow in between. And you want to make sure not to put a towel on top of those jars. I know that's something that a lot of people would do, just kind of, just felt like you were keeping them safe, maybe nesting them or something. But if you do that, you're basically keeping the heat underneath that towel and in between the jars. So leave that towel off, just make sure there's a couple inches in between the jars so that the air can flow through. Let them sit for at least 12 hours, no more than 24. And the reason for the no more than 24 is if you have some that aren't sealed, you can reprocess them, which we'll talk about. But after 12 hours, you can check the lids and you'll just press down on the lid, make sure that they're sealed. If you hear something that sounds like that, you know that it's not sealed at that time. So as long as they are all the ones that are sealed, you can remove that screw band. You might have to wipe the rim or the edge just a little bit in case there is any moisture that's built up there. And then you will label it and date it, and you can store it in a cool, dry place for about up to 2 years. You're gonna get the best quality of for eating this food in a year, and about 2 years. But if you have safely canned this product with a research-based method, you went through the process properly, it's going to last longer than that, but the quality of the food is going to decrease after that time. So I mentioned if you have any unsealed jars. If you do, if you have a jar that sounds like that and it pops when you press it, you can, there's a couple of options. You can reprocess that jar, and if you decide to do that, you will need to use a new flat lid. And again, if you remember earlier when I said the flat lids can only be used once, it might not seem like that lid has been used, but technically it has, because it has gone through the process. Even though it hasn't sealed, and maybe the lid is faulty, but even though it hasn't sealed, it has still been used. So you need to throw that lid away and use a brand new lid. So you can go through the process the same way. And one thing that I just realized that I forgot to mention when I was talking about filling the jars and putting the lid on, you want to make sure to wipe the rim of your jar. Okay, wipe it to make sure that it is clean, that there's no debris in between the jar rim and that plastisol. Okay, but if you're going to reprocess, you'll do the same process. Put a new lid and the screw band, and then you can reprocess that. Now, usually, I don't think it's worth it to reprocess it unless I'm going to be canning, more green beans or carrots or whatever it might be, or soup. Usually, I'll just eat it that night, or I'll put it in the refrigerator and eat it later. But if you are going to reprocess it, that's why we say 12 to 24 hours. You have to do that before 24 hours is over. But that's an option if you would like to do that. So after cooling, the metal lid, should be properly concave or curved down in the center. And so if you do have a jar that didn't seal, you also want to check your jar. Make sure that there's, not any nicks. If you need to change the jar, you can do that as well. But when we think about spoilage in canned food, there are lots of different reasons that food becomes spoiled. Sometimes it might just be the makeup of the produce. Maybe it was poor quality produce. Maybe it had something to do with the water. There's lots of things, and sometimes we can't always pinpoint the reason that a jar didn't seal, or the reason that your food became spoiled, or it started to grow a mold inside. Sometimes we can't pinpoint it. And some of this goes without saying, but here's a list here of not to use any food if the jar is not sealed. If there's lots of food that's sticking up out of the liquid that's dried, or if there's any seepage of liquid that's coming out from underneath the jar, if there's any air bubbles that you see either coming up or on the top, if there's any cloudy liquid that's in that jar, or something just looks unnatural, just doesn't look good, or even if you open it and it kind of smells funky, or if there's anything that you see that's growing. And like I said, some of that goes without saying, but those are the things that you want to avoid if you see any of that. And if you do see that and you've canned a lot more of that item, I would definitely check the other items and just make sure that everything else is okay. So before there are any questions, there was one other little tip that I wanted to share. I keep in my canning kit, and I guess I can go ahead. I keep in my canning kit an old-fashioned pipe cleaner. And this is to make sure, that my vent port is clear. So I will just put this in and make sure that there's no debris or anything in there. You can also hold it up and look to see if you have, if you can see light through it. And that is just make sure that that hole is clear. Are there any questions?
There were 2 questions.
Okay, what are the 2 questions?
First one was, have you heard any feedback about the quality of purr jars and lids?
I have actually not even heard of that brand of jars and lids, but I would say, just with my little knowledge of canning and canning supplies, that is probably one of those off-brand, maybe lesser quality jars. I'm not positive on that, but I have not heard of it.
And the other one was, how does it affect the food if you keep the pressure at, say, 12 when it recommends 11? I like to give myself a little bit of wiggle room.
I understand that. So if you canned, if your recipe says 11 pounds of pressure for 20 minutes and you canned at 12 pounds of pressure for 20 minutes, you are probably not going to see a difference. If you had that side by side with something that was canned 11 pounds for 20 minutes, you're probably not going to see a difference. It's when you get higher pressure or if it fluctuates. So like if you're supposed to can at 11 pounds and you bounce back and forth between 12 and 15 pounds, then you might see a difference. It might make your food a little mushier, but you're really not going to see a difference if you can it a little too high. Good question though. I know I kind of like to say, and I use the dial gauge, but I like to kind of stay a little bit above the 11 rather than right on it. Again, just kind of gives yourself leeway, especially once you're first adjusting the temperature of your stove and turning it down just a little bit to make sure that you don't get too high. You can leave it just a little bit above. You'll be fine. It's a good question.
And then I just want to confirm too, so you're not supposed to get the water hot at all before you add the jars into the water. You want to add the jars and then start heating it to a boil.
Yes, so you want to put your
I think that's all the questions then.
All right. Well, like I said earlier, if you have any questions at all, you are welcome to contact me here at the Woodford County Extension Office, and I will be glad to help. Or you can contact your local extension agent for Family and Consumer Sciences for help if you are outside of the Woodford County area. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.